Good evening, and tonight we are tracking what could become the most devastating military disaster for Russia since its invasion collapsed in early 2022, as multiple high-level Western and Ukrainian intelligence sources confirm that tens of thousands of Russian troops may now be encircled and cut, often a massive pocket deep inside occupied eastern Ukraine, in a critical stretch of Donetsk and Luhansk where Russian forces spent nearly 10 brutal months advancing at horrific human cost, only to now find as many as 80,000 soldiers, frontline units, reserves, artillery crews, and the logistical backbone that keeps an army alive trapped with supply routes severed, as Ukrainian forces execute what analysts are calling one of the most sophisticated operations of the entire war, striking not Russia's strongest defenses but the weak seams between overstretched units, launching synchronized advances from the north near Lyman, from the south near Donetsk's outskirts, and through daring deep strikes by airborne and special operations forces that seized key road and rail junctions behind Russian lines, closing the pincers around areas centered on Svatov, Kremina, and Rubizhny to form what is now being referred to as the Donbas Pocket, an encirclement of a scale not seen in Europe since World War EA, one that threatens to annihilate a large portion of Russia's remaining effective combat power in the east and potentially erase the very territorial gains Putin claimed when he illegally annexed these regions, all while sending a thunderous message that Ukraine, armed with Western weapons and hardened by months of brutal defense, is no longer just holding the line, but now capable of executing large-scale, complex offensives designed to decisively defeat Russian forces. Because this disaster was years in the making, as Moscow fixated on the symbolic meat grinder of Bakhmut, pouring elite units and ammunition into a propaganda battle while leaving its flanks thinly held by exhausted, undertrained, and poorly motivated units, creating a vulnerable bulge Ukrainian intelligence quietly studied for months using superior Western surveillance, then concealed its own preparations through deception, night movements, radio silence, and surprise, opening not with a massive barrage but with precision HIMARS and storm shadow strikes that paralyzed Russian command, destroyed depots and bridges, and froze reinforcements in place before mechanized brigades smashed through weak defenses to sever the Pisa 6 highway. Southern forces pushed north to seal the pocket, and special forces slammed the back door shut near Starobilsk, leaving Russian units broadcasting panicked messages that they are surrounded, immobile, and running out of fuel, food, and ammunition, with no clear orders coming from above, while inside the pocket sit battered remnants of Russia's Third Army Corps, depleted motor rifle divisions, local proxy militias, and critically, massive concentrations of artillery and logistics, the fuel trucks, ammo carriers, and support systems, without which no army can fight, turning this from a tactical setback into a potential strategic catastrophe that could fundamentally alter the course of the war and force the Kremlin into decisions it has spent 3 years desperately trying to avoid. Inside this rapidly closing pocket is the beating heart of Russia's war effort: mobile repair units, fuel convoys, engineering teams, and most critically, massive ammunition depots that feed the artillery-heavy doctrine Moscow depends on, with conservative estimates based on satellite imagery indicating between 45,000 and 55,000 combat troops and another 25,000 or more logistics and rear echelon personnel trapped alongside hundreds of tanks, armored vehicles, and several hundred artillery systems that will soon fall silent as shells run out, while mountains of fuel, food, and ammunition sit uselessly in place, exposed to Ukrainian precision strikes, because without resupply, a modern army begins to collapse within days as fuel dries up, vehicles stall, medical supplies vanish, and artillery, the core of Russian battlefield power, fires its final rounds and becomes dead metal, which is why analysts believe Ukraine will not rush a costly frontal assault, but instead methodically tighten the noose, reinforcing defensive rings, crushing any relief attempts, and using drones and long-range fires to pick apart command vehicles, equipment parks, and stockpiles until morale disintegrates and surrender becomes inevitable, setting the stage for a political and propaganda catastrophe for the Kremlin that Putin cannot tolerate, leaving him with 3 terrible options: mass surrender, a desperate breakout that would likely turn into a slaughter, or a slow starvation under bombardment, until entire formations simply cease to exist, while the shock waves race far beyond Donbas as Washington and Brussels immediately recalibrate. seeing definitive proof that Western weapons and intelligence are not a bottomless expense, but a war-winning investment, accelerating momentum toward F-16, longer-range missiles, and expanded aid, even as Moscow spirals into panic with state media scrambling to mask what could be an 80,000-man disaster, internal blame wars erupting between generals, mercenaries, and nationalist hardliners, and the economic and manpower toll turning existential as Russia, already bled white by casualties, estimated in the hundreds of thousands, faces the unthinkable question of where another generation of soldiers would come from, all while the human reality inside the pocket grows more desperate by the hour as intercepted communications describe abandoned armored columns out of fuel, medics begging for supplies they no longer have, wounded soldiers unable to be evacuated, hunger setting in as rations vanish, and infantry digging not to advance but to hide from drones that now dominate the skies, translating the sterile phrase, complete encirclement, into cold hunger, pain, and the terrifying certainty that there is no way out. A catastrophe unfolding just as Putin publicly claimed full strategic control of the war, leaving the Kremlin facing not just a battlefield defeat, but a collapsing narrative of strength, as families demand answers. Propaganda strains credibility, global powers quietly reassess their bets, and the balance of power visibly tilts, forcing the world to confront a question that once seemed unthinkable: whether this moment marks the beginning of Russia's irreversible strategic collapse. The Trump administration has spent months pressing for peace, talks described as constructive. But this development fundamentally rewrites the power dynamics at that table, because Ukraine is no longer negotiating from endurance or survival, but from demonstrated battlefield dominance instantly, stripping Russia's maximalist demands, especially recognition of annexed territory, of any credibility. As one European official put it, dialogue with Moscow only matters if it guarantees a lasting peace for Ukraine. And that possibility just moved dramatically closer, not through diplomacy, but through force, while the pressure on Putin extends far beyond the encirclement itself, because across the wider Donbass front, Russian forces have spent more than 18 months grinding toward Pokrovsk, amassing roughly 17 other troops and outnumbering Ukrainian defenders by as much as 8-1, yet suffering an estimated 200,000 casualties for minimal gains, and now the potential loss of a force half that size in a single stroke threatens to unravel not just one offensive but the entire Eastern Front, paralyzing Russian commanders who will hesitate to move reserves for fear of creating new collapses, bringing the war to a decisive precipice where three paths remain, the most likely and most devastating being a methodical Ukrainian reduction of the pocket as supplies vanish, morale shatters, isolated surrenders turn into a cascade, and 20,000, 3,000 or more Russian troops lay down their arms in a humiliation broadcast worldwide, forcing panicked retreats along the flanks and allowing Ukraine to reclaim vast territory in days, possibly back to pre-February 2022 lines, a shock that could threaten regime stability in Moscow. The second path, a desperate Kremlin-ordered relief assault, would mean sacrificing other fronts to launch a frontal attack into fortified Ukrainian positions. A modern charge into slaughter that could double Russian losses and still fail, turning any breakout into a shattered retreat stripped of heavy equipment and strategic credibility, the third and least likely option, attempting to resupply by air, would trap the force in a doomed siege under Ukrainian air defenses, creating a 21st century Stalingrad in miniature that prolongs suffering but cannot change the outcome. And so tonight, the world is watching not just a military disaster for Russia, but a strategic masterclass by Ukraine, because those 80,000 trapped soldiers are not just a number, they are a potential pivot point of the entire war. Proof that Ukrainian resolve, combined with Western intelligence and technology, can not only stop Russia's war machine but dismantle it, exposing the hollow core behind Putin's image of strength. An army overextended, poorly led, and now facing annihilation, sending a message from the frozen fields of Donbass that could not be clearer. The era of irreversible Russian gains is over. The initiative has decisively shifted, and the real questions now are not whether Ukraine can survive, but how far and how fast it can liberate its land, and what a cornered Kremlin may risk on the world stage as defeat closes in.